Ein, zwei, drei, vier, fünf, six.
Just checking to see if the microphone is working and we're not getting much of an echo or anything. For those who have joined in, feel free to type something into the chat, into the Q&A, just testing it out, and then I'm just going to put it on mute here again. We'll get started in just a minute.
I could. No, that was not. I wasn't calling you a walrus. That came out. That could be taken all wrong. Completely wrong. Hello.
Alex. She's an intern for the Tribune.
Amy. Was it Alex? Nice to meet you. I'm Lynn. Are you on summer break? Yeah, from?
I'm from Bismarck, so I go to University of Iowa.
Okay. Not enough corn around here for you, huh? No. What city is the University of Iowa in? It's in Iowa City. Man, the place is so nice they named it twice. Iowa City, Iowa. Or the University of Iowa. They named it thrice. The place so nice they named it thrice. Iowa University in Iowa City in Iowa.
Okay. So welcome to the Director's Cut for June. Beautiful day outside, and we've got April 2020 production information. So I'll let Lynn get started.
Thank you, Katie, and thank you everyone who tuned in and popped in for our Director's Cut for the month of June. We're talking about March and April production, and there's little good news to report. Let's start off with oil production. Oil production fell by 15%. This is the largest production drop on record. Our records go back to January of 1970, so they predate the agency, the Oil and Gas Division and the Department of Mineral Resources, and it's the largest we've ever seen. Natural gas production, slightly less bad. It dropped by 13%. We've been keeping records on that since January of 1985, and that too is the largest drop in history. So month to month, the largest declines in production that we've ever seen in the state of North Dakota, both in absolute terms and in percentage terms. I wish I could tell you that that's going to hold, but we actually expect May to be worse. And so when we're looking at the week of May 16th through 23rd, it would appear to us that there was probably, another 300,000 barrels a day reduction, and that will actually be a larger percentage in volume drop than March to April. So we'll see. Stay tuned. Please come back next month, and we'll see what the month average shows. But we know that we had literally a terrible week, the week of May 16th to 23rd. And so very stunning numbers. When we look at wells permitted, actually much more stable than I would have expected. We had 68 in March, 62 in April, and 59 in May. Now that's below the levels that we'd like to see for revenue forecasts and for the economy and for jobs. But it does indicate, as we've said before, that our operators believe in this resource and that they intend to stay and that they intend to have a 12-month supply of permits so that when they decide it's time to reactivate and get the economy going again, they've got the permits in hand to make that happen. Rig count, not so much, down 82%. So huge drop in rig count. Looked like maybe it perked up one between the time we did our director's cut and just now before I walked over here. So it's between 10 and 11 in that neighborhood. We're still anticipating one or two more decrease in that. So it is very likely that we're going to go below 10. In fact, one of the rigs that's operating that we're not counting here because it's not an oil and gas rig, but it's finishing up the work on Project Tundra, which is looking at all the rock layers for carbon storage. So we'll be losing that rig. Surprisingly, the waiting on completion numbers actually dropped slightly. So I would consider them held stable. And that tells us that one frac crew is able to keep up with 10 drilling rigs. So it's kind of an interesting metric. So we're not gaining or losing non-completed wells to any large extent. Completions are down significantly, only 58 in April, and to sustain the revenue forecast in terms of sales tax and employment income taxes, we should be looking at 90. So we're well below those levels. We saw a small increase in inactive wells, and that can be a little bit of a puzzle. So what's going on here? What we found, or what we've determined in talking with our oil and gas operators, is that there's no hard definition of a shut-in well. A well is shut in if you're operating it just a little bit each day. It would be considered shut in, but it wouldn't be considered inactive. So what happened was the oil and gas engineers took a look at shutting in all these wells and figured out that in the Bakken formation, if you shut a well down and leave it down for months, it's going to be very, very expensive to return it to production. So in many cases, they're just pumping these wells an hour or two a day, maybe every other day, maybe taking turns on a multi-well pad and one well for 2 days and another well for 2 days, so that the mechanical system stays in working condition, but they don't produce any oil to speak of. A little bit of water and little to no oil. So it's an interesting thing that, it's not showing up in the inactive well count, showing up in the shut-in well count, and seriously showing up in the production numbers. So that's just the way numbers work. When we look at producing wells, an enormous drop in producing wells, over 800 wells on the average. So even there, that is an indication that a lot of wells were shut in for the entire month of April, shut down for the entire month of April. What kind of wells were those? Well, you can see it in the conventional well count. I've never seen a conventional well count below 1,000, and we went to 390. So that is, if you look back to the pre-Bakken days, that's about 1/10 of the number of wells we had producing before the Bakken came along. So that is an enormous number. Those are wells that companies are comfortable shutting down for an entire month, or if they have more than a month in terms of holding their leases, the cessation of production clauses or operation clauses in their leases, they'll run the well just enough to hold the lease, but they're completely comfortable with shutting those wells down. So that's a record number in terms of conventional producing wells. Never seen that below 1,000. I think there were 3,000 when I took this job, and that's a long time ago. Okay. Already mentioned drilling rig count down 82%, completion crews down 96%. We do have one completion crew that's working pretty much full time, keeping up with, we've got some operators who hedged 70 or 80% of their oil. And so they're profitable, even through this virus pandemic. And so they're maintaining some low level of skilled workforce in terms of completing some wells. Just want to call your attention to the U.S. crude oil stock graph. That is not a good picture. Crude oil stocks should be dropping this time of year, and they continue to climb. Last month, we had seen a little bit of a drop, and we kind of thought, well, maybe things are improving. Maybe we'll get back inside the gray envelope. That graph is going to define whether we have a V-shaped or a W-shaped recovery in terms of oil prices. If as the price improves, like it did when the Saudi-Russian price war was taken out of the equation and we were looking just at demand destruction from the COVID pandemic, if operators respond to that with lots of wells coming back on production or completions and drilling rigs, then we'll see volatility and the price will drop again. And so that's not what we hope to see. We're hoping for a V-shaped recovery, but we could have one of those long cursive W's if we don't see some discipline. So we're tracking unemployment. The unemployment claims continue to rise. We're at over 9,000 unemployment claims from the oil and gas sector in the state. As we speak, by the end of next week, it's my understanding, certainly by the end of this month of June, the PPP program will have expired for these folks. And so we're anticipating a spike in unemployment claims as well, as we look a little bit forward. Not a whole lot to report on the federal level. Pretty quiet in terms of all the regulation stuff and litigation that we've often talked about. And I'll just close with gas capture. It's the only really good news in the whole report, permitting and gas capture. We got to 88% statewide. We got to 89% in the Basin. And we were expecting that as production volumes fell well below gathering capacity. And in fact, I think our gathering and processing system is probably running at around 65% of capacity, more or less. So it's near turndown rates, but it's operating, it's got surplus capacity. And so we saw, really great results outside of Fort Berthold. We got to 91%. That is not true on the trust lands, still lagging 82%, still looking for ways to solve that and resolve that, and working on that. And so overall, though, happy with the gas capture numbers. And when we had our hearing a couple of days ago on abandoned wells, the one natural gas producer that we have in the state, Little Missouri Pier Unit, said that with the drop in associated gas nationwide, they're seeing a strengthening of natural gas prices. And we saw that a little bit in the data, not to a great extent, but we're going to see that more in the May and June data, especially a lot of natural gas is used to make electricity, to run air conditioners. And we're coming into the air conditioning heat of the summer season, and we're seeing associated gas that would be coming out of the Permian and out of the Basin and all these places drop because oil production has dropped. So it has actually played to the benefit of the dry gas producers, the folks in Appalachia and in Arkansas, and this little bitty field in Bowman County, North Dakota, will be a beneficiary. So usually there's a silver lining to a cloud, and we have a couple with regards to our April numbers. So with that, we'll stop and take some questions. Katie?
Yeah, any questions in the room?
Yeah, so you mentioned when it comes to gas capture, we're at 88%. Are we saying, are we within our flaring target now, or is it ever slightly above 88%?
We are actually slightly above.
Or below?
Yep.
Okay,
Yeah. Below the flaring, we like to talk on the positive side, so our goal is 88% capture, and that, we talk about that statewide, but really it's for the Bakken, and so we're at 89% on the Bakken, and our goal right now is 88%. Now, let's not forget that November 1, that goes to 91. So we're not at 91 except for the outside Fort Berthold Bakken. But it's encouraging to see a number that starts with a 9 show up in the gas capture for the first time in years. So that's, really good news.
Yeah, and so with the 88% that we're at, is that meeting the goal? Like, I'm wondering, is it like 87.6% and we round up, or is it 88.2%? You know?
I do know. Just a second. I thought I wrote it down here with decimal points. So I think it was 88 point. It's either 88.4 or 88.6, but it's not rounded up. It's actually rounded down slightly to the 88. So.
And do you know, I don't know what's off the top of my head, when North Dakota was last meeting its flaring its gas capture target?
I don't know the answer to that. I think we'll see it on Justin's graph. Yeah. Let's wait for Justin's graph, and we'll actually see a picture of it rather than me trying to scrounge through my somewhat foggy memory on that.
Any other questions in the room? I do have one question that has come in online. Any predictions on, I think there were some estimates that production may have dipped below 1 million. Do we think that that's still the direction that it could head for next month's production report?
Yes, absolutely. We have placed that number at, somewhere between 925 and 970. So we're pretty confident that we're going to dip below 1 million in May, and that it could be as low as 925. We're hoping it's in the mid to upper 900s. I've seen some other projections of 950 to 975. So everybody I've talked to, they're all pretty much have consensus that we're going to be in the mid to upper 900s.
To follow up, how long could it stay up?
Great question. So the question was, how long could it stay that way? And looking at the data that we have coming in on a week-to-week basis, it looks like it's already gone the other direction. It looks like the low point was that week of May 16 to 23, and that we are actually back up maybe 100,000 barrels a day from that low point. So at least maybe 60,000 a day. So we think it's already turned the corner and on the way back up. I was hoping that the field inspectors would have a more positive report for me today, but with all the volatility that's been in the oil prices this week, companies just sat still. It was like somebody told their dog, sit, stay. And so it doesn't appear that anything really changed this week in terms of wells being brought back on or production being brought back on. They looked at the volatility in the market and said, let's wait a little bit, see what we're going to do.
I've got a couple more questions. One, there's been, in the past couple of days, past week or two, there's been a number of additional court documents filed in the Dakota Access lawsuit, related to, whether the pipeline is going to be shut down, so this environmental impact statement is, completed. And I guess I just want to ask, like, how concerned are you? How concerned is the state about the potential for that to happen?
Yeah, so the question was about Dakota Access Pipeline and the potential for that to be shut down while the EIS is conducted for an injunction, basically ordering the pipeline to be shut down until that EIS is completed, and the state's position on that. State is extremely concerned about that event occurring. And in fact, if you look at the documents, you probably saw a declaration in there, a couple of them with my name on them. So, we're talking about a situation that in the middle of all this disruption would add like a whole order of magnitude of disruption. So, for example, I talked about one of our operators that has 80% of their oil hedged and still has a frac crew running and is continuing to produce and has shut in very little production. Their production goes down Dakota Access Pipeline to the Gulf Coast, and they have VLCCs, very large crude carriers, there in the Gulf Coast being loaded for export of that crude oil. In that instance, that comes to an end. And so you have one top three operator whose 80% hedges evaporate in that event. And so, we realize that the numbers all kind of look alike, but that pipeline is still carrying 40% of our crude oil. And if that crude oil was going to find a market, it'd have to find a different way of getting there, which is weeks, months, maybe years to divert it to rail cars or to find some other pipeline transportation route. As you know, our other major pipeline out of the state that was planned, Sandpiper, was taken out of plan. It was canceled. And Line 3 is still hanging in Minnesota. So very limited pipeline export ability. The only other option would be go to Cushing, Oklahoma, which is almost 80% full in terms of storage. And so that leaves you with rail cars if you want to get it to the crude carriers and export it, or if you want to get it to a refinery. So the state is very, very concerned about that. I'm not going to try to guess what the odds are. We're just hoping that they're a lot better than 50-50. Yeah.
Great. And then one other thing I wanted to ask about, in the last month, there's been kind of these two big hearings, one on oil waste and, one the other day on compensation. And can you just talk about what your takeaways have been from those hearings and what you're thinking going forward, and when those might come up with the Industrial Commission, if that would be next week?
Sure. So two big hearings. Let's take them in the order that we had the hearings. The first one was the May 20th hearing on waste, economic waste. And the testimony, simply from the numbers, but also as we've been analyzing the testimony, was overwhelmingly opposed to a waste finding and any kind of proration. There were a few parties that favored that for various reasons. They didn't even have consensus, but the vast majority of those testifying in that case were opposed, again, for lots of reasons. But there seemed to be a lot of consensus around the fact that proration worked okay for the first decade that we produced oil here in North Dakota, but that was because there were two places for the oil to go. Their hedges didn't exist, NYMEX didn't exist, firm capacity on pipelines didn't exist, firm capacity to gas plants didn't exist, and so all of those complications really make it very, very difficult to come up with a proration scheme that would be fair. So that's kind of the gist of the testimony. That recommendation is going to go to the Industrial Commission for their July 7th meeting. It's been moved to July 7th from July 9th. So that's our plan, is to recommend an order, and I can't tell you at this point what we're going to recommend, but you might guess. The second one then, Wednesday, a very, very long hearing. 34 or 35 parties testified in person, and dozens submitted written testimony. And that was about confiscation of abandoned oil and gas wells. So we're rapidly processing all of that and trying to divide those wells up into bins. I'll talk about that in just a second. That is going to go to the commission next Friday. When's the 19th? I should stick with dates and not days of the week. I'm not so good at days of the week.
Next Friday.
Yeah, as a workaholic, I'm not very good with days of the week. So June 19th, we'll go with that at 10:30 in the morning. So we've been working on which wells just need to be confiscated now and begin plugging. Are some of the wells, so there's also a couple of bins of wells, some that just the threat of confiscation has motivated the operators to plug the wells. There's a little over bit more than a dozen of those. There's about 3 dozen where the threat has motivated operators to post the single well bonds and make a promise that within the next year they'll deal with it. And then there's a group that perhaps the operators should be given a little more time to come up with a single well bond or a plan for the well. Not much, but a little more. And then finally, there's a substantial list of wells that we were asked to add to the list. Sort of an interesting surprise. So there were a number of operators who evaluated their wells and said, I'm abandoning this well. I can't produce it economically ever in the foreseeable future. I don't have a bond to cover the plugging reclamation cost, and I don't have the cash flow to take care of it. So could it be added to the list? So we'll have to take a look at that too in terms of funding. And amongst all of that, June 18th, the Emergency Commission will take a look at the additional requests that we have forwarded for CARES Act money. The highest priority one is the $33.2 million to reclaim the sites of all the wells that we confiscate.
So that's not the same dollar amount as the other $33 million that was requested for plugging.
Right.
That's already been approved.
That's already been approved, the plugging, but we held off or were asked to hold off to see, kind of how the CARES Act money was shaping up, and how much was going to be needed, maybe to set up a field hospital or who knows what, and so you got to get in the order there. So there's a request going in for the reclamation funds, so that we don't wipe out our abandoned well plugging and restoration fund, but actually can use money from the CARES Act to follow up. And there are some non-well sites that that we're looking at. So there will be a much shorter hearing, probably in July, to cover the wells that people have asked us to add, and some sites that actually don't have a well on them but still need to be reclaimed. So we'll deal with that whole reclamation thing in that same case. And then we do have 2 other requests that we have sent in from the Bakken Restart Task Force. One would be to employ some pipeline people by boosting some WAS construction. That's our lowest priority. And then the middle priority one is a program that was conceived by our oil and gas operators. They have found a new type of, it's called a thief hatch that goes on the top of the tanks, and it has the ability to reduce the methane emissions from about 1 cubic foot an hour to 0. And so we are looking at a grant program where an operator could purchase the thief hatch, hire the roustabouts to install it, and then get reimbursed for the thief hatch. So they would be paying roughly 50% of the cost of installing those. We think we could cut our methane emissions by 15,000 tons a year in North Dakota with that. So we'll see how that goes. But so a long answer to a not so long question, but June 19th, there'll be a whole bunch of orders. We're going to do it an order for each operator as we take them to the commission. There are 50 operators on the list, actually 51 if you look at one company who asked for wells to be added, but we'll deal with that probably at our July hearing. And the reason behind that is potential litigation. We want to make it, simple so that we can know easily which wells we can get started on and which ones, might get held up for one reason or another.
I have a question that came in. Is there an update at all on the number of shut-in wells and also on drilling rigs operating? You may have mentioned it, but do we feel like that rig count number has maybe bottomed out and we may see rigs either start coming back slowly, or could we lose some more rigs?
I'll take the last question first, and that is we still expect 1 or 2 rigs to leave. So we don't think we've quite hit bottom at 10. So we think we could get into the single digits. Let's all hope and pray we don't get to 0 like we did in February of '99. We don't want to set any records, modern day records in that category. In terms of wells shut in, I'm trying to recall the numbers that we reported last week. See if I have that here. Because, like I said, we don't think it's really changed this week. So this is an old one. So we think we're at about, what did we report last week? Do you remember?
100.
Yeah. Is that it?
Yep.
Okay. So we reported about 6,800 shut in and somewhere between 450 and 475,000 barrels a day shut in. And we're pretty confident that that's where we still are. Operators just really took a pause. Mm-hmm.
And March 18th was the last month that gas capture goal was met. Or March 2018, sorry.
Yeah, not March 18th. March of 2018. Okay, so it has been years. Yeah.
Other questions?
I just have one other for you, Lynn, about from the consultation hearing. I know one of the concerns that a number of operators have raised was the potential for the state to seize their bonds and essentially reimburse the state for using the CARES Act money to flood the wells. Is that something that the state is looking at doing, or would the state just use the CARES Act money?
So the question was the concern expressed by operators about bonds and CARES Act money and how you juggle all of that. And so I think the answer would be we're likely to end up using all the CARES Act money and maybe a little bit of bond money. We'll see how the costs come in. They made a very good point that we wouldn't use the CARES Act money and then double down on it by confiscating the bond to pay for the same thing. We're not allowed to do that statutorily. The abandoned well fund is not a profit, it's a nonprofit, okay? And so it's not a profit-making entity. So our anticipation is that we're going to work through all the CARES Act money first, but if we still have orphaned wells that need to be plugged and they have single well bonds on them, We statutorily can confiscate those, and we very well may. But they'll be at the tail end of the process. So we're prioritizing the process to leave those to the tail end. Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Thanks, everyone.
Okay, ready? Okay, well, good afternoon, everyone. Justin Kringstad, Director of the North Dakota Pipeline Authority. We'll get right in on a regional look at what's happening with oil production from eastern Montana, South Dakota. We've seen some updated production come from Montana, so that those volumes have bumped up from what we've been looking at the last couple of months as they catch up with some of their reporting. South Dakota dropped below 3,000 barrels per day. And the challenge then is we're trying to do some predictions going forward is what those two states will look like here as we go into the April, May, June timeframe. I suspect that we'll see some pretty substantial decreases, given, again, the type of production and the location at which those operations are. If we take a look at slide 3, again, this is that month-to-month change. This one's pretty self-explanatory this month as far as what we were seeing on that change. I am anticipating that going from April to May, May was an extreme month, as Lynn alluded to, probably the deepest part of this downturn. And so we may either meet or exceed those month-to-month decreases as we see the main numbers next month. In slide 4, this is kind of just for your information, and it helped me kind of understand a little bit of what we were looking at with that data when we went from March production to April production and trying to understand what wells were cutting back production. And so what you're looking at on this graphic, it takes a little bit of explaining, is what you're looking at are wells that had greater than a 75% decrease, 75% or higher decrease from March to April production, and where those wells were located spatially. If you would have asked myself a number of months ago, if a downturn occurred, what wells would we see get pulled offline or see a substantial reduction? I may have initially thought more of the fringe areas that we would see some of that decrease in production, but as the data is coming in, it's pretty universal. And talking with the operators and the midstream companies, it's across the field. We're not seeing it concentrated, say, in the northern part of the play or the southern part. It's universal. And if you look at the bar charts, again, that's just, again, putting some numbers to the map. McKenzie County had the highest number of wells and the highest volume of production that was impacted using that 75% metric. What makes this a little bit tricky is, again, having to just choose what metric I was going to use to create this view. But we know that the latter half of April was the most extreme. And so using that 75% threshold, wells that were producing for half or more in April wouldn't be showing up on here, but they will show up in those main numbers as being shut in. So I think this is going to be a little bit conservative. As we get to the May numbers, we'll likely see far more wells on here and a far greater impact from a production standpoint. And then translating this now into the traditional discussion surrounding transportation, a few minor changes. We did see an increase in rail market share, not volume-wise, but again, just that market share movement. Again, April, May, pricing around the U.S. and around the globe were very much in flux. And so some of the things that we would traditionally expect to see weren't necessarily happening. We know that the Brent WTI spread in the month of April was quite low, which would typically not be conducive to market share going up on rail, but in this case it was. Again, as storage during that time was filling up and refiners were picking and choosing what types of crudes they wanted to run. So again, things aren't following exactly as we would predict in a more normalized state. And then just again on the pure volumes wise, right around 280,000 barrels per day is the estimate for crude by rail from North Dakota. And destination wise, a little update from the EIA. They're now again showing that West Coast continuing to be the preferred marketplace. We have seen some additional barrels go to the Cushing area by rail. The Gulf Coast has kind of pulled up back a little bit, again, with Dakota Access having ample capacity, at least today, with these decreased volumes. So we're not seeing the crude by rail to the Gulf Coast at this time. And then again, just a quick snapshot of pricing around the region. Nothing necessarily out of the ordinary. When you look at the rail netbacks and pricing that PADD 5, it all makes sense that if a barrel was going to move by rail car, that PADD 5 or the West Coast would be that preferred route, given its proximity to North Dakota and the lower cost structure going west than going east. And where we sit today, again, relatively low WTI Brent spread. But again, things are still so much in flux with storage volumes in the Gulf and at Cushing and around the U.S. that it's real difficult to predict, again, what we should expect to see in the coming months. So we'll have to just hold tight here a little bit and see how this continues to shake out, because again, it's evolving very, very quickly. Did not get, so I was not able to get the April numbers from the U.S. Trade Commission. So this is just a repeat. March is the latest. Once I'm able to get that data set from them, I'll update this going forward. On the natural gas side of the world, the flaring percentages, again, we saw that statewide shrinkage. So this is statewide. Lynn was alluding to 89% capture Bakken specific, but again, just looking at statewide, non-confidential production, we've seen consistent with that blue piece of the pie, or those wells that are continuing to flare from non-connected facilities, and we're continuing to see a lowering of the volume and the percentage of the flaring from connected facilities. Again, that makes sense as production gets shut in. That's freeing up space on the gathering systems, at the processing plants, through the compressor stations. So at least during this time period, as Lynn clearly mentioned, this was one of the silver linings that we were expecting. We'll continue to watch this as we come back out and we start to see shut-in production coming online, and how that's all going to shake out here with the production and processing dynamics. And then again, very low numbers of new wells producing natural gas, but one other positive, when you have lower numbers of wells coming online that are being completed, it's obviously a much easier task to keep up on the gas gathering side. But again, we're dealing with much lower numbers than we traditionally would. EIA, this is just a quick snapshot for everyone where they're at with their short-term energy outlook, as well as coupling that with their long-term energy outlook for WTI pricing. They've updated this, that they're holding it fairly steady for the rest of 2020, right around that $34, $35 range. So they're not seeing, at least in the near term, the next 6 months or so, not a lot of price strengthening in their forecast. So I've built that into my expectations. But post 2020, as we get into 21, 22, they are expecting a more robust recovery and demand for that crude oil, and obviously the price then starts to increase. And when we look at the natural gas side of the world, the processing and the production, you see that deep V that we're anticipating when the May numbers and the June numbers come out. The big unknown right now that everyone is grappling with is how deep does that V get, and what does the recovery look like? In this image, we're showing a fairly quick, by year end 2020, that the shut-in production is back online. But again, we don't have history to base that on, and right now it's a lot of speculation. So we'll see if that gets drawn out further, if it theoretically could come online faster, but that is a very big wild card right now. In any scenario, the positive is that the infrastructure investments that have been made over the last 12 months are there. So if we do see a more rapid recovery, we should have ample near-term processing to handle that gas. So we'll continue, at least in the near term, to stay in a very good position on gas capture. Long term, we're still looking at the timing of when those next set of plants are going to be necessary, what type of localized gathering and compression needs for the state. So keeping our eyes on the long term, but again, trying to understand the dynamics in the near term and how it all translates out. And the last thing I'll mention is on the Northern Border. Last month I mentioned that Northern Border had filed a tariff filing with the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. On May 29th, there was a commission order that the tariff, which would have an 1,100 BTU cap, exit Glenola, North Dakota. So FERC's order accepted and then immediately suspended that tariff until November 1st. And so between now and November 1st, FERC staff is going to be holding what's known as a technical conference. So they will bring the interested parties together and work through some of the challenges that were brought forward by the various intervening parties about that 1,100 BTU and what would it mean to the pipeline company and downstream markets, and at the same time, what does it mean to upstream producers and the state of North Dakota's oil and gas industry. So again, no timelines have been set as far as when that technical conference will occur, but as those details continue to come forward, I'll make sure that everyone's up to date on that. So with that, that's the last prepared remarks. I'd be glad to answer any questions.
Do you have a sense as to how, I don't know if disruptive is the right word, but I'm going to use that word, how disruptive the first order could be for North Dakota?
So the question was, what does the FERC decision ultimately mean for the various parties in North Dakota? So there's many different stakeholders, and so during that FERC process, at the end of, by that May 29th decision, there was 11 parties intervening in support of it and 11 parties intervening in opposition to that tariff filing. Most of those in support were on the downstream side, the end users, the LDCs, and interconnecting pipelines. Much of the opposition was coming from the upstream side, the gas processors and producers in North Dakota. And if you're a facility in North Dakota and you're purely a gas processing company and you have the technical capabilities, it would have relatively low impact to you. Any additional cost that would come from having to capture ethane, which is the molecule that's being debated here of whether it can get on Northern Border or whether it has to be handled differently. The highest value is for that ethane to go into Northern Border right now. With an 1,100 BTU limit, a portion of that ethane would no longer be able to be placed in Northern Border. So there would be an additional cost to the producing community if this tariff structure were to go into place. So again, depending upon the party that you're speaking with, they're all going to have a different view on it, but ultimately any ethane that would not make it into Northern Border would have an additional cost to the producers, the royalty owners that move gas on Northern Border.
Speaking of gas, this is maybe a little off topic, but I'm just very curious. Have natural gas processing plants ratcheted back in North Dakota?
They have. So the question was, have we seen a reduction in the throughput or the capacity or utilization of our gas processing facilities? And we have. Some gas processing facilities during some periods of time were completely shut down. Others that have larger complexes where they have multiple processing trains, they may shut down one train or two trains and continue to operate one at a more optimal rate. And so we have certainly seen across the state a reduction in the utilization of our gas processing facilities.
You know how serious it is, or how much they've actually back? I assume that's probably
Yeah, so if we look at it just statewide, it's in that mid-60% of utilization still, right? So that'd be 35% reduction kind of statewide. Again, for those that have multiple, ideally you want that facility operating as close to nameplate as possible for economies of scale. So if they have multiple trains, they'll shut down one or two in order to keep one operating at a higher utilization. So, yeah.
Okay, you mentioned that the percentage of oil transported increased by rail. Do you have any sense really as to why that's the case for everything? So,
I think, yeah, so the question was, what may have led to that increase in the utilization of crude by rail? Ultimately, the volumes were down it was the percentage that went up. And again, I think it just had to do with where could barrels be moved at any given time during the month of April. So going forward, as we look at May, there's a lot of unknowns, and it's real difficult again to try and predict what's going to happen when there's a lot of floating storage out there. You've seen the reports of crude carriers in the Gulf Coast, along the West Coast, and just an abundance of crude everywhere. And so if you're a refinery and you have flexibility to either buy waterborne barrels or crude by rail, which is really the two alternatives for the East and West Coasts, it'll be interesting to see how the market shakes out, especially when we start to see the May, June numbers here.
Perfect.
Okay.
Another one?
Well, thank you very much.
Great. Thank you guys for coming.
Thank you.
When you, with the